The city mouse and the country mouse. Far out in the rolling countryside, where the hedgerows grew thick and the fields stretched on for miles, there lived a mouse named Thistle. He had a cozy little burrow tucked beneath the roots of an old oak tree, at the edge of a meadow that turned gold with barley every summer. Thistle's life followed the same gentle rhythm, season after season. In spring, he gathered wild strawberries from the hedgerow. In summer, he nibbled fat grains of wheat straight from the stalk. In autumn, he stored acorns and hazelnuts for the winter, and in the coldest months, he sat snugly in his burrow, listening to the wind rattle the branches above, perfectly content. It was, by any measure, a simple life. But it suited Thistle just fine. One crisp autumn morning, as Thistle was busy carrying a hazelnut back to his store, he heard the rustle of grass behind him and turned to find a rather smart-looking mouse standing at the edge of the meadow, brushing dust from a fine grey waistcoat. "Cousin Thistle," the newcomer exclaimed. "Is that really you?" It took Thistle a moment to place the face, but then it came to him. "Cousin Nibbles, I haven't seen you since we were both barely out of the nest. What on earth are you doing all the way out here?" "Visiting family, of course," said Nibbles, though there was something in the way he glanced around the meadow, at the plain earth, the tangled hedges, the modest oak, that suggested he wasn't entirely impressed by what he saw. "I do hope you don't mind my dropping in unannounced." "Not at all," said Thistle warmly, for he was a generous soul and had always been fond of his city-dwelling cousin, even if they hadn't spoken in years. "Come and see my home. It's nothing grand, but you're very welcome." He led Nibbles down through the tangle of oak roots and into his burrow, which was small and snug, lined with soft dried grass and packed neatly with stores of grain, nuts, and dried berries for the winter. "Sit, sit," said Thistle, gesturing to a smooth flat stone he used as a table. "You must be hungry after your journey. I haven't much in the way of finery, but what I have, I'm happy to share." He laid out a simple meal, a few grains of barley, a handful of dried peas, a wedge of hazelnut, and a single wrinkled strawberry saved from the last of the season. Nibbles looked at the spread with a polite, if slightly strained, smile. "How rustic," he said, picking up a grain of barley and turning it over as though he'd never seen one before. "Do you eat like this every day, cousin?" "Every day," said Thistle proudly. "It's simple fare, but it's honest, and there's always enough. What more could a mouse want?" Nibbles set the barley down without eating it. "Thistle, my dear fellow, I don't say this to be unkind, but I really don't know how you bear it. Grain and berries, day in and day out, in this drafty little hole under a tree? In the city, I dine like a king every single night." "Do you now?" said Thistle, more curious than offended. "Indeed I do. Roast duck, ripe cheeses, cake crumbs so sweet they'd make your whiskers tingle. Why, just last week I found half a custard tart left on a windowsill, still warm." Nibbles sighed happily at the memory. "You really must come and see it for yourself. A mouse of your character oughtn't waste away out here in the middle of nowhere." Thistle laughed. "I don't know about wasting away. I'm quite happy, truth be told. But I admit, you've made me curious. Perhaps I will come and visit, just once, to see this grand life of yours." "Splendid," said Nibbles, clapping his paws together. "We'll leave first thing tomorrow. You won't regret it, cousin. You'll see what a real life looks like." The journey to the city took the better part of the day. Thistle had never traveled so far from his meadow before, and he watched with wide eyes as the hedgerows gave way to stone walls, the stone walls gave way to cobbled streets, and the open sky slowly disappeared behind tall buildings that blotted out the sun. By the time they arrived, the evening had turned to full dark, and the city was alive with light and noise in a way Thistle had never imagined. Lanterns glowed in windows. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. Voices and laughter spilled out from a grand house at the end of the street, where golden light poured from every window. "That's the house," said Nibbles, practically vibrating with excitement. "There's a dinner party tonight. Come on, this way." He led Thistle through a gap beneath the garden wall, across a lawn trimmed as neat as velvet, and in through a small crack beneath the kitchen door. The moment they slipped inside, Thistle's nose was overwhelmed by smells he had never encountered in his life: roasted meat, warm bread, melted butter, sugar and spice all mingling together in the warm air. "Follow me," Nibbles whispered, "and be quick. We want to reach the dining room before the servants clear the table." They scurried along the skirting boards, past the enormous, echoing kitchen, up a narrow gap behind the wall, and out through a small hole beside a grand fireplace, and there it was. The dining room table towered above them like a mountain, but Nibbles knew exactly where to go. He led Thistle up the leg of a chair, along its arm, and onto the very edge of the tablecloth, where the remains of a magnificent feast lay scattered across gleaming white china. Crumbs of roast pheasant, a smear of rich gravy, half a wedge of ripe cheese, the sugared corner of a tart, and a scattering of sweet cake crumbs. "There," said Nibbles grandly, spreading his paws wide. "Now tell me honestly, cousin, have you ever seen anything like it?" Thistle stared at the spread before him, utterly speechless. I've never smelled anything so wonderful in my whole life." "Then eat," said Nibbles. "Eat as much as you like. There's more where this came from." Thistle crept forward and nibbled a corner of the cheese, and his eyes went wide with delight. He tried the cake crumbs next, then a taste of the gravy-soaked bread, and for a few glorious minutes, he forgot all about barley grains and dried peas and wrinkled strawberries. This, he thought, truly was a feast fit for a king. But it did not last. A sudden burst of light flooded the room as a door swung open, and heavy footsteps came thundering across the floor. "The dogs are getting into the pantry again," a voice bellowed, and with it came the sharp click of claws on wood and a deep, ferocious barking that seemed to shake the very table. "Run!" Nibbles shrieked, and the two mice bolted across the tablecloth, scrambling over plates and diving off the edge of the table just as an enormous shaggy dog came skidding around the corner, jaws snapping. They tumbled down the chair leg, dashed beneath the sideboard, and squeezed through the gap behind the fireplace with the dog's hot breath practically on their tails, its bark echoing off the walls like thunder. They didn't stop running until they were safely wedged into the narrow crawl space behind the kitchen wall, hearts pounding, chests heaving. "That," Thistle panted, "was rather more excitement than I bargained for." "It happens sometimes," said Nibbles, though his own voice was shaking. "Don't worry. It'll pass. We'll wait a moment and then go back for more." They did wait, and after a while, the barking faded, the footsteps retreated, and the house fell quiet once more. Cautiously, they crept back out toward the dining room, only to freeze at the sight of an enormous orange cat curled up on the very chair they had climbed only minutes before, one eye half open, watching the room with lazy, predatory patience. "Not tonight, then," Nibbles whispered, pulling Thistle back into the shadows. "We'll try again once the house has gone to sleep." They waited in a dark, dusty gap behind the skirting board, and Thistle, despite his exhaustion, found his stomach growling with hunger. The good food from earlier had vanished all too quickly amid all that running. Hours passed. At last, when the house had fallen fully silent, they crept out once more, made their way back to the table, and had barely begun nibbling a fallen crumb of tart when a sharp, metallic snap rang out from the corner of the room. A mousetrap, sprung on some unfortunate crumb of cheese, missing them only because Nibbles happened to glance up in time to see it and pull Thistle back by the tail. "Cousin," Thistle said shakily, once they had retreated to the safety of the wall gap once more, his heart hammering. "Does this happen every night?" "More or less," Nibbles admitted. "The dog, usually. The cat, sometimes. And you do have to watch for traps. But honestly, once you get used to it." "Once you get used to it," Thistle repeated slowly. He looked back toward the grand dining table, gleaming faintly in the moonlight through the tall windows, still laden with more food than he could eat in a month. Then he thought of his little burrow beneath the oak tree, small, plain, and utterly free of dogs, cats, and traps. "Nibbles," he said at last, "I thank you for your hospitality, truly I do. Your feast was the finest thing I've ever tasted. But I don't think this life is for me." "Are you quite sure? You've barely had time to enjoy it." "I'm quite sure," said Thistle, and for the first time all evening, he felt something loosen in his chest, not disappointment, but relief. "I would rather eat plain barley in peace than dine on roast pheasant in fear. A simple meal eaten safely is worth far more than a grand one eaten with your heart in your throat." Nibbles considered this for a long moment, glancing toward the corner where the mousetrap still sat, freshly sprung, and then toward the door through which the dog had come crashing only hours before. "You may have a point, cousin," he admitted quietly. "I suppose I've simply grown so used to the danger that I stopped noticing it." "Come and visit me sometime," Thistle offered. "No feasts, I'm afraid. But no traps, either, and no dogs waiting to eat you before dessert." Nibbles managed a tired laugh. "Perhaps I will, at that." The next morning, before the household had even stirred, Thistle said his goodbyes and set off back along the road that led out of the city, through the stone walls, past the hedgerows, and out into the wide golden meadow where his little burrow waited beneath the old oak tree, exactly as he'd left it. He gathered a simple meal that evening: barley, a few dried peas, the last hazelnut from his store, and ate it slowly, savoring every plain and humble bite, with the wind rustling gently through the branches above and not a single dog, cat, or trap in sight. And from that day on, whenever Thistle told the story of his one grand adventure in the city, he always finished it the same way. Better a simple meal eaten in peace than a feast eaten in fear. The end.